Hello, you are listening to the Marriage Underdogs Radio Show podcast, and I'm your host, Chris A. Matthews. And once again, we have another phenomenal guest. And yes, you're right, it is a licensed marriage and family therapist. I want to introduce you all to Jamal Jones, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist out of California. Jamal, welcome. How you doing?
Chris, I am doing well. Thank you so much for having me here today.
And I'm glad you could be here. So I always start with this question. Quickly share with the audience what got you into the field of counseling, specifically marriage and family therapy. And I always love to ask this question to African American men because we represent a small population of the field.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, frankly, as a kid, my dream was to grow up one day and become a pastor just like my father. So I come from a household of faith. My mother is a devout woman of faith. My father is a pastor. And when I finished college at Fresno State, where I played football on a scholarship and got involved with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, my first career was in ministry with FCA, and I was a pastor. And I literally got scared back into graduate school during the 07-08 economic crisis. And that's when I decided that the skills are the gifts that God has given me in terms of being empathetic, compassionate, being a good listener, loving people, serving people, nurturing relationships, giving practical tips on how to be better. I really felt that getting the degree in marriage, family, child therapy was an excellent transition out of the pastoral ministry into the secular world as a marriage and family therapist.
I appreciate you sharing your history because a lot of our family of origin plays a role in how we look at our future careers and professional choices. I want to jump right into our topic. In this episode, we're going to focus on creating a judgment-free relationship with your partner. And something comes to mind when I think about judgment. There's this concoction of words, right? We have judgment, we have guilt, we have shame, we have responsibility. So let's unpack these. And I want to start with, when would you say it's safe or necessary to pass judgment within a relationship? Or is it never safe or necessary to do that?
Well, with a spiritual context, as a faith-based, emotional-focused marriage and couples counselor, my clients really want to have some integration of spiritual beliefs that's integrated with the evidence-based practices. And what I've discovered, Chris, is that many people of faith need to adopt and nurture what I call a grace-based identity. And in order to do that, it all begins with the basic understanding that nobody's perfect. And the ability to have that awareness of our own imperfections, our own insecurities, that we don't always keep our own word, that we often let ourselves down. The more self-aware we are in that sense, the easier it will flow toward extending that compassion and empathy and making for allowances in how we relate to others.
So I'm hearing you say that, Jamal, the foundation starts with grace and giving yourself that grace, acknowledging your own weaknesses, your own shortcomings, being that we are human, we are flesh. However, when does that line of grace rub up against self-love to the point where I'm not going to allow someone to hurt me because I love myself enough to not be put in that situation, or I love myself enough to have boundaries that I'm going to enforce to be respected? Talk about that.
Physical, emotional, spiritual, financial safety, psychological safety, is always priority number one. It is of utmost importance that you as a person feel psychological safety and emotional safety within yourself and in how you relate to others. Just yesterday, I was in a session with an individual, and I reminded this young lady, this adult woman, who she's a wife and a mother of two, and I reminded her that she is not obligated to remain in contact with her biological mother if she does not feel physically and psychologically safe around her.
Hmm. So you've given a really clear definition for when judgment is utilized in a safe and an appropriate manner. And from what I'm hearing you describe, judgment can be used when your physical, emotional, financial, spiritual, and I know you mentioned a couple others, but when that safety is breached, it's no longer judgment. At that point, it's protection.
Exactly. And it's all through a lens of self-care. Foundational to having the best possible mental health and being able to show up as your authentic self in your marriage or relationship. You want to think through things through a lens of self-care. And the more self-aware you are about your emotional needs and every other complex need you have at a human level, that's going to inform you on threats that come in and how to set boundaries, boundaries being a gate. You know, this gate, you can close this gate to protect yourself from danger and negative influences, toxic influences, but you can also open this gate to invite in people and relationships that are life-giving and nurturing and supportive.
So when we really break down that judgment of ourselves, the judgment of our partner, we're processing initially a breach. So without boundaries or without standards, there's really no judgment.
Right.
Not appropriate judgment, I would say, right? So like a lot of times in the work we do as couples counselors, we'll always hear a couple defend themselves. And the defense usually looks like, well, you did that too. Or it's a double standard. Talk about what couples can do to avoid judgments that aren't necessary or equivalent or don't match the relationship boundaries.
One thing that's very fascinating about relationships, and particularly a marriage and any couple relationship, is each relationship in our life gives us more insight about ourselves. The way that we respond to people, the way that we resolve conflict with others, the boundaries that we have, our lack of boundaries that we have. So I like to tell clients that when they're engaging in these conversations with their partners, our family, our loved ones, whatever the case might be, each interaction is giving them more insight about themselves. And one of the best ways I've heard it described is when you're in a relationship, draw a circle around yourself and focus on improving and growing the person in that circle. And one way to apply that practically is in a relationship, your spouse or partner sometimes might be 90% responsible for what happened. Still, you want to take responsibility for that last 10% that you're responsible for.
Got you. So what I'm hearing you say, when we're in a relationship, there are two pieces to that. The first piece you said was when we're in a relationship, the only thing we can control are our responses and our own choices. So we don't judge our partner for our response or our choice. And in domestic violence or interpartner violence situations, you hear someone say, they made me do it. They made me angry, or they'll blame a substance. The alcohol made me do it. So bad judgment looks like not being accountable or blaming someone else for your actions. The second thing you said is that a relationship with yourself is that circle. So you have two circles inside of a bigger circle, and that bigger circle that houses the two circles, which represent the partners, is the shared space. So you're really managing three relationships: the relationship with yourself, the relationship you and your partner have collectively, and then that relationship your partner has with themselves. And I say with themselves because if your partner is an alcoholic or a substance user or an abuser or bad with money, you're still enmeshed in some category of connection because you're married or in a relationship. So their problem inadvertently becomes your problem in a way as well. So that gives you authority to place a judgment, but that can't be done unless you first look at yourself. And we talk about, and I want you to share more about this. I know in therapy we talk about an enabler. Talk about how an enabler will be quick to pass judgment.
Yeah. So in situations where a person is in a relationship that's intimate partner violence, where they're enabling a person to abuse them on an ongoing basis, or they're in a relationship with someone who has a serious alcohol problem, or as you also indicated, financial problems. People are people. We all have our issues. We all have our problems. So again, that self-compassion is crucial for ourselves, particularly when it comes to enabling. I love the first step of AA. I'm a huge advocate of the 12 steps because that first step is all about acknowledging powerlessness. And when you care about somebody, one of the most difficult things to do is to allow your spouse or partner to hit rock bottom right before your very eyes.
Now, I want to add to that. Your partner hitting rock bottom right before your very eyes can be hard when you have that shared space that includes children, or includes shared income, or includes a shared dwelling. Talk about what couples or intimate partners can utilize instead of judgment. So to make the question clear, when my partner and I are engaging within a conflict that is induced by their actions solely, how do I respond in order to create safety and security for myself or my children without just being judgmental?
One thing immediately is to be aware of the pattern of communication. Oftentimes, people are coming to counseling because they've fallen into a toxic pattern of communication. And as you know, Chris, domestic violence is predicated on this ongoing sense of fear, intimidation, power, and control. And so people are in this pattern of fighting for control. They're in this pattern of rescuing someone who has a serious problem. And so you want to first identify the pattern. And part of this pattern is an event happens and you find yourself once again in this argument. And once again, it's escalating and impacting the children and others involved. So in a moment of self-awareness, you can catch yourself and say, you know what? I have a pattern of engaging in the same argument. And usually it has the same consequence where negatively impacts me, my partner, our kids, our income. This time, instead of engaging in this argument, how can I remove myself from the situation? Does it mean to just peacefully walk out into a different room? Does it mean to leave and go for a drive. In some cases, does it mean to go stay at someone else's place overnight to have safety for that period of time until things cool down?
Or does it look like being willing to enforce a consequence? There are three steps to that, right? Like you mentioned three steps. I want to reiterate. You talked about identifying the pattern, choosing to acknowledge the cycle, and then identifying where you fit within the cycle and how you could alter that cycle, right?
Yes, yes.
The other three steps then would be, first and foremost, partners have to communicate what the boundaries are. What are the agreed upon expectations? So we know what it looks like to cross them. Second, what consequences are we going to put in play if or when those boundaries are crossed? And third, are we both willing to enforce and accept the enforcement of those consequences? Because I used the example of my own marriage, cheating is not a consequence, cheating is not a choice that either my wife and I are going to accept. So the consequence would be the conclusion of the marriage. And that was made up front. Now, if that agreement changes because we haven't had to enforce that consequence of divorce, then that's another conversation. But yet we at least have step 1 and 2. Step 1 is cheating is defined as these things. Step 2, if cheating happens, then the consequence would be divorce. But step 3 would be, are we willing and able to enforce divorce? And that third part usually isn't necessarily known until, unfortunately, you're in that situation.
Yes. And again, underneath all this is safety. You want to always be monitoring your spiritual, psychological, physical safety. And your body will talk to you. Your children will talk to you. You have family and friends who will talk to you. Your number one priority is safety. On the basis of your safety, you reserve to take any action you deem necessary to remove yourself or set the boundary needed to ensure your safety. To your point, even more, Chris, is oftentimes when clients go to individual counseling or marriage counseling, a lot of the time can be spent just on, okay, you've been talking about this boundary. You've been married to this person for several years, and the problem has been reoccurring the duration of this marriage. But for some reason, you've never had the internal strength and the support to actually enforce the boundary, the consequence. And that kind of goes back to where when we enforce the consequences, once the boundaries are set, now that gives our partner an opportunity to either take a hard look at themselves and adjust, make a change, or stay the same. But if they stay the same, how willing are we to make the change, to make the adjust? I'll end with this. The definition of being insane, in this case, insane in a marriage, is to do the same thing over and over again, to have the same conversation over and over again, to have the same pattern over and over again, and expect a different outcome or a different result.
And that was spot on. And I want to highlight a couple of things as we close out. The main question that we started with was, how do we create a judgment-free relationship? And the answer we've gotten to is a judgment-free relationship is replaced by a relationship where there are boundaries, there are consequences if those boundaries are breached, but more importantly, those consequences are enforced. Because we're replacing judgment with the enforcement of actions. We're also replacing judgment with the ability to have compassion and look within first. We're also replacing judgment with the responsibility to keep you and your children or your family safe if you're in a violent or domestic abusive situation. The responsibility to identify the patterns and the responsibility to alter or change how you respond to those patterns, because in your words, doing the same thing expecting a different outcome is an insane marriage.
Exactly.
Jamal, you put on a master class. This was great. I gotta have you back. I definitely want to have you back to go deeper into the shame and guilt, but you knocked it out the park with judgment. And I love how this dialogue and the conversation we had today was able to produce fruit. For anyone who's listening, they'll be able to have clear steps and points to take away from our dialogue in order to develop a judgment-free relationship, so it's not an insane marriage.
Yes, yes.
Jamal, I'm gonna make sure we put all your information in show notes so clients that are seeking a counselor or a coach can reach out to you. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to have, to be here so I can interview you. And for those that are listening, Marriage Underdog Radio Show, we launch a new episode every Tuesday at 10 a.m. on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Like, follow, share, and we look forward to bringing another phenomenal guest to you next week. My name is Chris A. Matthews. You just had an opportunity to hear from Jamal Jones, licensed marriage and family therapist, and we look forward to seeing you for another episode next week. Thanks.